The Druchii warlock frowned at the center of the chamber's stone.
"You're certain this faces directly north?"
Melchior said, in his sibilant tongue. Nagash glanced up from the pages of the book. "Of course," he said. "The pyramid is precisely aligned with the four corners of the earth.
It's vital to maintaining the aura of preservation within the tomb. Have you no understanding of geomancy in your homeland?"
"Geomancy," the warlock sneered. "How quaint." He stepped forwards and laid a black-gloved fingertip against the sandstone. "Never mind the fact that this material is a poor conductor of magic. Marble works far better." Nagash scowled at the pale-skinned figure. 2 years of imprisonment had done little to blunt the arrogance of the three Druchii. Once they had accepted the terms of Nagash's agreement, they had quickly demanded everything from fine foods to books and other entertainments, which they seemed to regard as nothing more than their due. The Grand Hierophant had humored them, within reason. Over time, their prison had expanded to include more than a dozen adjoining chambers, and he had taken pains to furnish them so that they would enjoy some measure of comfort. The great chamber where he had first revived the Druchii had become their workroom, and the margins were crowded with bookshelves, tables, and chairs. Nagash crouched in the center of the space with a large, leather-bound book open before him. The thick pages were covered in copious notes dictated by the Druchii and copied down in Nagash's hand. Since he had begun his training, Nagash had committed everything he'd been taught to paper, both for his own reference and to ensure that his tutors remained honest. A horse-tail brush and a small pot of ink sat on the floor beside him.
"Marble and gold,"
Druchii hissed.
The lithe, white-haired witch was lounging like a sunning cobra on a low divan across the chamber, tracing a set of Nehekharan glyphs with an elegantly pointed fingernail.
"This cursed land is too far from the north. I can barely sense a glimmer of power here. Perhaps it is this pyramid,"
Ashniel said, raising her dark eyes from the book she was reading and regarding Nagash hatefully. The Druchii straightened, extending her slim white arms over the reading table in a cat-like stretch.
"We should be teaching you in the open air, not shut up in this awful burrow."
Nagash grunted in amusement as he reached for the brush and ink.
"So the lion said from the hunter's pit,"
he replied.
"Perhaps the fault lies in your perceptions, Druchii. The pyramid is a potent focus for mystical energies. The mortuary cult has interred our kings in such crypts for centuries to maintain the invocations of restoration."
Within the first few days of their imprisonment, the barbarians seemed to have appointed roles for themselves. Melchior took on the lion's share of Nagash's tutelage, setting a difficult and demanding pace of lectures and exercises. Druchii assisted Melchior during the more complicated lessons, but preferred to focus her energies on more physical pursuits, and despite repeated failures, her attempts at seduction continued unabated. Meanwhile, Ashniel treated the Grand Hierophant with nothing but contempt, keeping to her books and reading voraciously about Nehekharan culture, religion, and, most importantly, the construction of their crypts.
It was clear to Nagash from the beginning that Melchior and Druchii were meant to distract him, each in their own ways, while Ashniel kept to herself and looked for a way to free themselves from Ketep's tomb.
The hateful witch had been careful to cover her tracks, but not quite careful enough, and Nagash and Khemri had found evidence that Ashniel had managed to breach the first layer of traps surrounding their apartments, and was making slow but steady progress, exploring the lower levels of the crypt. The battle of wits, keeping one step ahead of the witch by changing the location and nature of the traps, had become a diverting pastime for Nagash and his favored servant. The Grand Hierophant dipped the brush in the black ink, consulted the tome open before him, and began to paint the sigil on the floor.
"You are certain this will work?"
he asked, tracing the complicated lines with care. "I am certain of nothing in this place," Melchior growled. The warlock folded his arms and watched the sigil take shape on the sandstone floor.
"Druchii is right. This land is a desert in more ways than one. The winds of magic are very weak, scarcely stirring the ether. And, as I've said often enough, your kind has a feeble grasp of magic at the best of times."
The warlock let the implication of his statement hang in the air between them. "You may not be capable of this." Nagash clenched the brush tightly in his hand and focused on crafting the sigil.
"If this does not work, what then?"
he asked curtly. Melchior shrugged. "There is nothing else," he said.
"This ritual isn't even an accepted part of our magical law. It's the sort of thing practiced by shade casters and gutter witches, who lack the will to harness the winds of magic."
He spread his hands.
"If this attempt fails, the fault lies with you, human. I've tried everything I can think of."
Then a murmur of voices echoed from the passageway beyond the workroom. Nagash glanced up from his work as Khemri entered the room with a hooded figure in tow.
"Here he is, master,"
Khemri said with a bow.
"Allow me to present Imheb of the House of Hapt-Amkesh. He should serve your purpose in every particular."
The hooded figure swayed slightly on his feet. Imheb reached up and bowed his head with shaking hands. He was young, only 60 or so, with large, watery eyes and a receding chin. A short black wig sat askew on his shaven head.
It is an honor, Grand Hierophant,"
he said, in a slightly slurred voice. "Your servant said you requested me personally?"
"Did you drug him?"
Nagash asked, frowning at Khemri.
"Well, yes," the young priest replied. "I thought it prudent, all things considered."
The Grand Hierophant glanced worriedly at Melchior.
"Will that cause problems?"
The notion seemed to amuse the Druchii, who said,
"That depends on how much effort you intend to put into your lesson."
He pointed to the flowing black lines.
"Just be careful that the fool doesn't scuff your hard work with his plodding feet."
Imheb was glancing around the dimly lit chamber with befuddled interest, taking special note of the two witches. "What? That is... how may I be of service to you, Holy One?" he asked. "My friend Khemri mentioned a reward of some kind." "He has debts," Khemri interjected. "Imheb is something of a gambler, you see." Nagash eyed the young noble closely, noting the lack of rings or other jewelry, and the man's worn kilt and sandals.
"I take it he's the sort that loses a great deal. Won't his debtors inquire after him?"
Khemri shrugged. "Perhaps, but what will they learn? No one saw me with him, master. I was most careful." "We had some very fine wine," Imheb said, his lack face quirking into a grin. "Where was that again, friend Khemri?" Nagash bent and finished the sigil with a few deft strokes of his brush, and then beckoned impatiently to his servant.
"Bring him here," he said. "But be careful of the glyphs."
Khemri took Imheb's arm and led the drugged man across the room as though he were a child. "Mind your step," he told the noble as they approached the edge of the sigil. "That's right into the center." "Forgive me, Holy One," the young man said with a chuckle. "I'm not certain how much help I am going to be at the moment. As I said, it was very fine wine."
"Get that cape off him,"
Melchior commanded. At a nod from Nagash, Khemri darted forwards and jerked the cape from Imheb's shoulders, revealing the noble's narrow, bony chest. "Careful!" Imheb barked. "That's my good cape. I'll be needing that back." The warlock paced slowly around the edge of the sigil. "Where are the implements?" he asked. Imheb turned his head at the sound of Melchior's voice. "What's the barbarian saying?" he asked. Khemri reached into his belt and drew out a pair of long bronze needles. The young noble's eyes widened.
Merciful Ptara, what are those for?
Melchior glided like a snake towards Khemri, his eyes glinting. He reached out and delicately pulled them from the priest's grip.
Yes,
he murmured.
These will do.
He turned to Nagash.
Hold him.
Nagash seized Imheb's lower jaw and wrenched his head around until they were looking eye to eye. The noble let out a startled cry, which turned to a scream of agony as the Druchii stepped inside the sigil and drove the first needle into Imheb's lower back. The young noble collapsed to his knees, shrieking in agony. Nagash watched as Melchior put his free hand against the side of Imheb's head and bent it to the side, exposing the tendons of the noble's thin neck. With a hungry smile, the warlock plunged the second needle into the juncture of shoulder and throat, and Imheb's entire upper body went rigid. Melchior worked the needle deeper into Imheb's chest.
Remember our discussions on nerve clusters and their uses,
he said dispassionately. This will keep your subject alert and suffering, but unable to interfere. Nagash looked into Imheb's eyes, drawn by the gleam of pain radiating from their depths.
And the suffering is important? He asked.
Druchii chuckled. It is not vital, she admitted, but it is certainly entertaining. The warlock frowned at the interruption.
We were speaking of sandstone earlier, he said. Some physical objects channel and store magic better than others, but none work so well as flesh and bone.
Humans, as I said, have a poor grasp of magic.
But like all living things, their bodies accumulate power over time.
Melchior traced a fingernail across Imheb's cheek.
Can you feel it? He asked.
Fascinated, Nagash reached out and laid a hand on the noble's forehead. He cleared his mind and tried to employ the techniques the warlock had taught him.
After a moment, he shook his head.
I feel nothing.
Melchior smiled.
Touch your fingers to the needle, then, he said.
The Grand Hierophant's gaze fell to the needle jutting from Imheb's torso. Tentatively, he reached out and laid a finger on its round end. The noble stiffened, his eyes widening in pain. The metal trembled against Nagash's fingertip. It was cold to the touch, and then he felt it, like a faint thread of fire pulsing against his skin.
Yes, Nagash whispered. Yes! A terrible, hungry light grew in his eyes. At the last!
The warlock loomed over Imheb's shoulder, his face lit with ghastly joy.
Give me your knife, he said.
Nagash's hand fumbled at his belt. The pulse of power sent a tremor through his frame, quickening along with Imheb's pulse. He handed over his curved knife without hesitation, ignoring Khemri's quiet protest. Melchior pulled away the noble's wig and cast it aside.
Now we shall draw that power to the surface, he said,
laying the point of the knife against Imheb's scalp.
Hours of agony will shape it and strengthen it as your victim struggles to survive. And when the time is ripe, we will cut his throat and the life force will pour over your hands. Then your education will begin in earnest.
Slowly, carefully, the Druchii began to cut into Imheb's skin. Nagash watched the warlock work. After a moment, he turned a page in his book and began to take careful notes.